Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Reputation Today Prime Time with social media influencers. This edition of RT Prime Time is presented in association with The Practice, a dynamic communications firm. The Practice, in association with Reputation Today, unveiled the second edition of the Social Media Influencers Listing Engine, better known as the Smile Report, yesterday. Today, we will look at a short video by the team that worked on this report on the methodology used. This will be followed by a panel discussion with some communication leaders who feature in the list. Today's session with these leaders will lay focus on the social media influence of communicators. A warm welcome to all our panelists and the 180 plus registered participants who have logged in today using the platform created by VirtueBlitz. This session is also being streamed live on our YouTube channel at bit.ly RT on YT. So if you're facing any problems connecting to the platform, you can always switch to YouTube, but without the option of asking any questions. For those who are attending using the platform, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A box, and the moderator will try to pick as many as she can in the last 15 minutes. Before I introduce our panelists, let me remind you that the hashtag for today is RTPrimetime. Please tweet using the hashtag RTPrimetime, and don't forget to tag our partner at TPR India along with Rep Today Mag. I would now like to welcome Nandita Lakshmanan, founder and chairperson at The Practice, to share the thought behind the study. Nandita.
Good evening, and thanks, Anubhuti, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. There is no dearth of rankings and lists in our industry. So why one for social media influencers, you may ask? Over the last few years, we have seen our industry, or should I say community, grow. Firms have begun to scale, not just in terms of revenue or number of people, but in terms of geographies, budgets, offerings as well. The time has never been better for us, and the advent of digital has been the mighty leveler. All of us here today are strategists, advisors, executors in our own right. And given the exposure we have as practitioners, we underleverage the power of social media. The Smile report we launched last year is to applaud those who have chosen this medium to share their views, support our industry, stand up for it, bust myths, and expand our intellect. It is a list, not a ranking. And we hope that many more of us will be inspired to take the leap to experiment and excel on social media with integrity, dignity, clarity, and authenticity to propel our industry and the world's understanding of what we do and the impact we create to the next level. Before we share a short video, I want to thank our esteemed panel of Karthik Srinivasan, Ipshita Sen, founder Engendered Co., Rita Bararia, Senior Director SCORE, and KS Narahari, Senior Consultant with The Practice, for participation in the final calibration process and sharing their invaluable insights to make this list what it is. The team at Reputation Today, Anubhuti and Amit, and our colleagues at The Practice, Abhishek Sen, Anirban Tiwari, Samir, and Hari. And before we begin, let's show you a short video.
Thank you, Nandita, and thank you, Team Practice, for that video explaining the details. I would now like to introduce and welcome our panelists for today. Girish Balachandran, Managing Partner on Purpose Consulting. Melissa Arulappan, Head of Corporate Communications at Equibia. Minari Shah, Director of Public Relations at Amazon India. And Rohan Vyavaharkar, Director Marketing and Communications at Omidyar Network India. And moderating the panel discussion today is Sylvia Mason, Senior Creative Planner at The Practice. Over to you, Sylvia, now.
Thank you. Thank you, and welcome everyone to today's panel discussion on the topic of social media influence of communicators. You've just met all the panelists, but I just want to take a moment to warmly welcome them all for making it to the Smile 2021 listing. Well done. And we hope that as we wander through our panel discussion today, you'll be sharing some more insights and learnings that I'm sure all our listeners will be keen to hear from. So today's topic is a fairly broad topic. And so we've chosen to narrow it down a little bit so that we can handle it and we're going to handle it in two parts, time permitting. In the first part, we're going to address how we can enhance the practice of communications today in an environment where social media is increasingly relevant in terms of community engagement, as well as in the information dissemination process. And in the second part, we want to ask our panelists to share their insights on how we can perhaps shift the needle a little bit towards overcoming that digital divide that exists in our country, and doing this through social media influence, either in their roles as communicators or as advisors to brands, organizations with social media influence. So let's get on to it. Let's get started. We've got much to discuss and debate. To start us off, I think if in the last 18 months, we have witnessed, everyone will agree that we have witnessed completely unparalleled acceleration of digital transformation. And this has happened globally. And it's been spearheaded by the COVID pandemic. And of course, this has also extended itself to the accelerated growth in social media conversations and communities, some of them good, some of them not so good. Looking at a recent internet survey that I was referring and preparing for this discussion, in the first week of lockdown in March 2020, Indians surveyed for that report spent more than 4 hours every day on social media. And this was an increase of 87% from the week before. The same survey also found that 75% of people were spending much more time on Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp compared to the week before. LinkedIn has also seen a hugely increased usage, but probably more importantly, they have recorded levels of engagements that have just rocketed. It's up 31% in the second quarter of 2020. So what is all this saying? What we know is that many more people are on social media. Many more are really actively engaged on social media. In fact, the numbers are such that it wants me to rephrase that saying, every man and his dog, to become every person and their social media handle. Social media has really democratized the way we communicate with an unparalleled acceleration. Anyone can be a storyteller, anyone can be a commentator, and we're starting to witness really strongly polarized views that can spread like wildfire, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not so good, and can derail the best laid plans. So while access has been scaled, so have the risks. They've gone up as well. So in this context, I would like to ask our panelists for their perspective on how we can enhance the practice of communications to play a role in building strong community engagement and to really be a key means of disseminating authentic information. What should be the things that guide us as influencers or advisors to influencers on social media? Do the public relations best practices stack up? So I'm going to ask Girish to start us off on this discussion. Girish, what guides you as a communicator on social media?
Thank you, Sylvia. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, good. I couldn't have started without that. I think that has to be the line of the last year at least. Um, so, firstly, thank you, Sylvia, Nandita, Anubhuti, Reputation Today, practice of putting this together. I think it's given me lots to think about, especially in the context of, our role as communicators. And to your question, how do I sort of, start with myself and reflect on, our purpose, my purpose as a communicator. So I'd like to start by saying I really believe that being a communicator is both a privilege and comes with a lot of responsibility. And I say privilege because if you look at the communications industry, not just in India but world over, most of us have had the privilege of private school education, a certain lifestyle, an income standard, and have lived and grown up in a certain social circle that has allowed us to access opportunities that have led us to become communicators. It is a privilege that we must recognize, but also at the same time seek out more diversity in our ranks if we're to truly represent the audiences that we need to reach and engage, either for our organizations, our brands, or the causes that we're championing. And I say responsibility because of the power of communications. If you look at most of the problems that are plaguing the world today, you can clearly see how communications can play a role in informing, educating, and persuading people to think, act, and behave a certain way. And history has shown us, and today we continue to see, how leaders with powerful communication are able to mobilize people around a shared sense of belief and purpose. And those with more liberal, sort of egalitarian agendas have rarely been able to keep up. Therefore, as communicators at the helm of such a powerful craft, the way in which we guide our teams and our organizations to look at what we do through the lens of diversity and inclusion and balanced arguments is so important. Good communications has to start with good listening, and that hasn't changed. Whether it was social media, even before the advent of social media, it always started with listening. But it's just that now, with social media, the way in which we listen has become so much more sharper because of the way in which we're able to communicate on social media, and what we see is such polarized views and agendas. And I think I'm remembering a quote somebody once said that it sounds like most of us are just one comment away from a tantrum on social media. So the power and benefit of a good balanced argument seems so rare that we hardly ever see it. So from a social media context, the power of listening, knowing who's on your side, knowing the agenda of both sort of promoters of a cause, the naysayers, the people who don't really have an opinion but may be influenced by things that are said and done, is where there is a new skill required to be able to analyze all of that and then decide how you want to communicate.
Thank you. That's so the responsibility certainly shifts and into new territories. So that's really important aspects there. What about you, Melissa? Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you think are the key factors that are going to help us enhance communication and guide us to do better?
No, I completely agree with Girish in terms of the responsibility and the privilege. Social media offers us communicators tremendous opportunity, but there's responsibility and there's risk. And I think we have to weigh that in whatever we do and how we behave on social media. I'd also say that as communicators, particularly, the role that we play is twofold. It's as custodians of our corporate brand, or corporate brands if you're in an agency situation, and as custodians of our own brand. And I think this to a large extent defines where we play our roles, how we play our roles, when we play our roles. How I behave and how I manage my corporate brand and my corporate handles is very different from how I behave as an individual. I'd also say that the platforms also determine the kind of role that I play. And this is something that I learned early on from an influencer colleague of mine when I was asking her for her own insights and learnings. And she talked about how she defines her role by the platform. What I am on Twitter is very different from what I am on LinkedIn. So I think, there's a play of various things over here. It's what handle you're managing, which platform you're on, etc. Now, coming to your part about communicators, I think there's tremendous responsibilities that we have as communicators in general, and I'd like to touch upon some of these. I believe we have a role to engage, nurture, and grow our own community. There's so much that we need to do to professionalize our industry more. There's so much evolving and changing in PR and communications. How do we share our insights and learnings with the next gen of communicators? How do we guide them? How do we mentor them? How can we do all of this, online? I think that's very important. The second thing, and this goes back to an Edelman report that talked about 4 in 10 people now showing poor information hygiene. And that's very scary on social media, I'm talking about. So they're not regularly engaging with news. They're staying within echo chambers. They're not vetting information, not checking its veracity before spreading it. And we're as guilty, perhaps, of the same. So I think it's important for us, and it's a responsibility we need to play as communicators, to invest in our own teams, to be able to identify fake news, to be able to kind of, cull out relevant, important, authentic news from the vast amount of noise and information that there is out there. We need to question. And finally, there is that social purpose that we all play as, brands, whether individual brands, organizational brands. As you've said it, and as Nandita alluded to as well, I think during the pandemic, there's been a tremendous responsibility that's been asked of brands, of individuals. And I think that's led to a lot of introspection. Also, situations and developments globally also have led brands to question the role that they play beyond just marketing their products and services. And I think that's, again, another responsibility. So those are 4 things I think that communicators have a tremendous responsibility to do and play today.
Thank you. That's really adding to that. I wonder, Minari, what are your thoughts? I mean, you're and this could be from your background as a communicator, or perhaps the organizations that you represent. Just taking off from what Melissa was saying about the social purpose and responsibility that brands often have to have in playing a role on social media.
So I think I've always held that PR or communication teams are often, as the reputation custodians, the conscience keepers of an organization. And I think that was true even before social media ever came in. What's happened, I think, kind of scrutiny that social media has brought in makes that task that much more important, but also challenging. I think earlier one could kind of, one was divided by geographies, one could kind of be saying, brands were not necessarily held up to the same level of accountability of what they're saying in different parts of the world. Social media has kind of just collapsed those boundaries, and you can't kind of, just say different things across different audiences or different geographies and so on. So I think as a communicator, I often think that it's not that something's changed dramatically. We always had the social responsibility of saying the right narratives. We always had the responsibility of kind of playing the role of guiding our organizations and brands not to transgress and kind of have the right role models or be the right narratives and so on. What's happened, I think, at the risks and the challenges and the opportunities have all become that much more larger. But sometimes I do tend to worry that because of that, people tend to think that social media is something completely different. No, you have the same narratives that you always had. If I'm working for an Amazon, or if I look at any of the brands I've worked for earlier, Tata Motors, Dell, they're not going to change their nature because of social media. They will remain who they were or change because of other compulsions beyond just social media. So the narratives will not be determined only by that. What social media does is how are you really speaking through it. And yes, it does have a risk. You spoke about polarization. Yes, I do think companies could sometimes be in the danger of being damned if they do and damned if they don't. And that makes it that much more harder for companies to really take the responsibility of what they say. Of course, companies have a responsibility, but companies have multiple stakeholders, multiple audiences. Um, you know, if one talks about polarized audiences, it's likely that all of them are customers or partners or employees. And one can't say that one point of view versus other is necessarily that easy to take. Having said that, yes, I think companies have been compelled to do it. I mean, we saw companies coming out and speaking on Black Lives Matter, and companies learning to take a stand, because I think that's something that social media is perhaps enabled, where the stakeholders, whether it's customers or partners or employees, in a lot of times, actually a lot of that is being driven by employees themselves when they're really asking for companies to really be kind of taking a stand on some of these key issues. And it's not just someone outside. And social media has kind of brought this together as a voice that we as communicators now need to channelize and kind of constantly calibrate. What I often want to tell a lot of people, and I go through these risks myself, it's been a process of learning, is to remain thoughtful and not rush into a response. We've had kind of experiences where you see a reaction coming in, you're tempted to react, you do end up reacting as a brand, and then it kind of goes further. So you do need to kind of calibrate that what's the right time, how should you respond, and that thoughtfulness, I think, has really become very critical. And that's really true whether we are as individuals or as organizations, that one has to remain that much more thoughtful, that much more calibrated. And I'm sometimes surprised that when we're commenting on any of the platforms, that level of calibration sometimes seems missing when people talk as individuals. And I would just say that that's just super important.
So the risks are high, and the speed at which something could disrupt are huge, be it individually or as an organization. But yet it's a requirement, even down to employees. They want us to have purpose and to be part of it. So I'd like to come back to a couple of those points in a minute. But before that, I'm just going to ask Rohan, how do you feel about it all and the discussion so far? What would you like to add in terms of perhaps what guides you?
Yeah, and thanks, Sylvia. And I actually just what Minari was saying, right? Like, I think one is, I think communications has been the conscious keeper. And look, I think the real way to think about communications is, whether it's PR, whether it's brand, whether it's digital marketing, I mean, eventually the consumer doesn't care, right? So ultimately putting the consumer first in all of this, I think, becomes super, super relevant, right? And I think, therefore, if you look at social media, and let's step back a little bit, sort of the way we've been trying to do it at Media Network India, like, if you step back a little bit and say that, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, I think social media played a slightly different role, right? Like, for example, the big change that I'm seeing is, we're driving now focus on people and not data, right? When you're thinking of social media campaigns, when you're talking about emotion and not Excel sheets, right? Like, I think that's really sort of come to the fore, right? Like, how do you develop? I mean, and again, this is not to say that we didn't do it, but I think it's even more relevant today, in a world where we're separate, where authenticity and really sort of celebrating and telling those stories is really, really important, right? Because ultimately, that's the whole power of that. That's how you're going to unlock the power of social media, is when you have when you have social media sort of really unleashing what your brand is capable of in that sense, right? Like, really being able to craft those stories. The flip side to that, however, is your crisis management is now real time, right? Whereas we could go from print deadline to print deadline in a real sense. Now we're sort of having to deal with crisis, like Minari was saying again, and Girish was saying as well. Like, a lot of our responses really need to be made in real time, even though we need to think really deep in terms of what we're saying. And I think the whole responsibility that communications therefore plays is really in ensuring that we pull back at all times, see the larger picture, and sort of filter it through these levels of authenticity and through these levels of, is this really true to my brand, or am I just moment surfing, right? Or am I hashtag surfing or whatever? Like, that's not important, right? Like those might seem good on a presentation you make to management, but in the longer term interest of the brand, it's not really valuable, right? So I think that there's that. And then just quickly want to touch upon, as communicators, as individuals, as as people who run teams and who have colleagues, etc. I think what's important is to be able to play that role of a mentor, right? Like trying to explain to people that, look, just like a brand isn't just its social media handle, you are not your social media handle, right? Like, so being on social media, I think, and it's not, I think, we know now, data has shown us this, right? There's enough research to tell you that it's bad for mental health, right? So this whole idea of self-validation constantly, I think, is very important. And then the other, and the other thing is also that, I also feel like it's important to push your creative boundaries, right? Like, think beyond social media as well as on social media in terms of what is possible, right? Even for yourself, when you're trying to craft a niche for yourself. So that's kind of the worlds that we sort of straddle in, and I just wanted to put that out there, and I feel like it's important to recognize that. My ending remark is just to recognize that in a post-pandemic world, social media will only be as important as the value that you put on it, right? As a brand, as a communicator, and it, just because we're now in a more digital world, I don't think it's necessarily more important. It's because there are other ways to do it, and I feel like the environment that we're in will only force us to be more creative to find the solutions.
Thank you for that. I want to just there are a couple of points that I'd like to go back to on that as well. But going back to this crisis management point that we raised, I mean, one of both Rohan, you said, Minari said, just wanting to know here, this is a question from your experience, and hopefully you can talk about maybe an anecdote or so. We all, in a way, we seek for the wildfire to go, right? It can be a good thing when something goes off viral, as it were, but sometimes it can be a bad thing. So in your experience, or can any of you talk about an experience where, how do you stoke the fire when it's needed, or how do you just have the right tamping down when it's going in the wrong direction? I'm sure our audience would love to hear some tips of ways or situations where you've had either and had to tackle it. Anyone?
So let me pick up something which is relatively easy to talk about, but also easily identified. I think when the lockdown happened back in March 2020, I think, we were in an odd phase. Suddenly, we had customers needing the products that, they wanted, either things that they'd already ordered before the lockdown happened, or they were wanting as the lockdown happened. And yet we had the ground realities of the various kind of issues which a lockdown posed. We also had the challenge that newspapers stopped coming to lots of people. So we couldn't even easily communicate. And that's when we really took to social media even more, because that became our means of communicating. And there were a lot of cases where there were a lot of policy issues. It was almost surreal. Each district had its own policy about what was allowed, what could be delivered, what couldn't be delivered. But our customers didn't really know or care about that. All they know was, we need this, and we are in this situation and it's urgent, and how do we get it? And when are you going to deliver? And we needed to almost go city by city, because our teams were discussing it district by district, city by city, about getting them opened up and allowing for products to be. And we literally started using social media to say, okay, now we're delivering in Lucknow, now Pune, now Mumbai, now Thane. And we were actually, and it was amazing how important it was. And we could see media picking it up initially from there. Now, that to me was a very classic time when we really needed social media, and we did a lot of things. We used our own channel with the blog, which we amplified very strongly in social. And then we had Amit, who is the country manager for Amazon in India. We had him tweet a lot of times because a lot of the media and a lot of people were following that. And we had that picked up, and that kind of carried its own momentum because we needed our customers to know. And in turn, we kind of linked it back to our website where we put specific city by city, pin code by pin code detail about which pin code was allowed, because they had those red, green zones and all of that, if you remember back then. So we had like pin code wise details and people could go back. So that was a point when we needed the social media piece to really be very, very strong. But at the same time, there was a lot of angst coming in from customers from the social media, because it was really hard for us to explain to everyone that nuance. And there was a lot of unhappiness, a lot of anger, a lot of need. And we had to kind of constantly balance that. And the only way we could do it was staying true to our message, saying we're doing everything we can, we will deliver the best we can, and here is the information. And that was the only thing we could really do.
Yeah. I mean, honesty and authenticity prevails in the end is basically what we're saying, right? We just keep to the script. Thank God for Amazon in that time of delivering to all. We survived with that. Before we move to the next topic, I just have a quick point to ask. Anyone can answer, but Rohan brought up the point about how you have to push your creative boundaries when you're communicating in this area. I wondered, in your experience, and given the polarized nature of the discussions that exist, are there some conversations that click better? Are there some easy wins for us budding influencers in the audience? What is there anything that you could point to? Anyone?
Okay, so I think a lot of it depends on being clear about what you stand for as a brand, and also then identifying the audience that associates with these values. So I'll give you an example. I mean, this is probably the most famous example in the industry, is that of Nike and Colin Kaepernick, the athlete that they supported at the cost of ignoring a large segment of the population, but choosing to make that stand because they knew that that was also the stand that their loyal customers would have wanted them to take. And choosing a stand by nature of it means that you are choosing to be with a certain segment of population as against everybody. Similarly, I mean, if you look at what Zomato did in terms of, standing up for one of their drivers who was being accused of, he was a victim of communal sort of bias and prejudice. And for them to sort of stand up and say, food is the only religion we believe in, and to have taken that stand was also then to appeal to a certain segment of the population that is definitely more vocal on social media, that would have gone out of their way to sort of, praise them, etc. So I would say a lot of it comes down to knowing your audience as the key sort of, principle, and then being clear about what you stand for as an organization, and then finding others, finding the people who also believe in those values over just the product.
Thank you. That's good. Now we're actually on the cusp of being over time on this, but I'm just going to ask Melissa, you wanted to share an example too, so please.
Yeah, because I just did an analysis, in fact, of our LinkedIn handle yesterday. And I can tell you, even globally as well as India, the same things resonate on our handle: employee stories. No matter what business you are in. And we just did a survey on our global handle, in fact, which has about 1 million followers. And the top want or ask was to hear these employee stories. It's the same thing even with our India handle. I find my 5 top posts in the whole year have been employee stories, employees who've contributed to the community, employees who've won awards. People want to hear these stories. And I think maybe it's the pandemic as well. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how this changes. But I think people want to hear about the community. They want that sense of, everybody's in this together, people being recognized. It's all about each other and colleagues and that spirit of camaraderie and community, I think, that's resonating right now.
That's great.
I think just one point to that I would add is Melissa is absolutely right. And the authenticity really matters there. Because what we saw is, for example, if I take the second wave, all of the companies that I know had to struggle to find ways to help their employees. And suddenly we started seeing these organic LinkedIn posts and social media posts where employees suddenly started saying, we know Amazon has our back, because there was all this infrastructure which was created. And those posts had incredible. We couldn't have engineered it. We couldn't have done anything. No social media influencer or communicator could have created that. So I think it finally goes back to that. So you can be creative, but finally, I think stick to what you do really well to your audiences and communicate. So we were communicating to our audiences internally all that we were doing, in terms of making infrastructure available, oxygen concentrators for them and their families in hospitals and so on and so forth. And that worked. So sometimes I think it's really important to just stay true.
And bringing it back to what Rohan said, make it customer first. I mean, if you're telling a story, make sure you're putting your customer at the center of it, or whoever your audience is at the center of it. Rohan, and any final points to add to that before we move on? Because I think you've put your hand up to share.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to go back to your original question. It feels like we've moved on from there, but just just in the sense that just also keeping in mind that social media is a part of the continuum. Like whenever there's a crisis, the crisis may break on social media, and the issues might sort of surface there, in which they often will in these times. But I feel like having that perspective that this is going to play out over a longer period of time. So like Minari was saying earlier as well, like you don't need to feel compelled to react instantly. And then and one example I can share from a much earlier time is when I was with Red Bull and FSSAI, which is the Food Safety Standards Authority of India, would often give us negative sort of indictments without actually even telling us, right? Like they would go and talk to the press before, and what we realized was that if we just continue to do good work and put it out there, right, and we just continue to talk about all the positive stuff that we're doing, that eventually and yes, there will be detractors, but I think that's just the power. I mean, that's actually good, because you want the detractors and you want democracy and you want freedom of expression as far as brands are concerned, and sort of being able to talk freely about them and what people don't like about them. So provided you invite all of those that sort of commentary, and recognizing that you must continue to build your body of work, and that's actually your best sort of counter. Like Amazon did, right? For example, or and there's several examples of during the Girish was saying as well during the pandemic. Just recognizing that continuing to build that body of work is actually your best antidote to any of the poison out there, I think is critical.
So stick to your knitting, and I guess while things peak really quickly, they do die down quite quickly as well. So if you hold your peace and hold your calm, you can weather the storm. Thank you so much. Lots of insights there, and we'll come to a summary towards the end of it. But I just want to move us on to the second part of what we want to focus on, which I think it is a bit of a leap, but it's an important leap. As we've been saying, I mean, there's no shortage of discussion around the fact that that there are so many more. We're witnessing a world which is increasingly digital, and we talked about that and the speed of which it is. But I think one point is that it's arguably not the same rate of inclusion, particularly in a country like India. Yeah. So I think the most recent IAMAI Kantar, which is the Mobile and Internet Association, the Kantar survey, has internet users reaching 67% of urban population versus 31% of rural population in 2030. Okay, so there you can see already there's the difference. However, Having said that, this digital adoption is being propelled by the growth in rural India, which is clocking at something like 13%, the study says, the growth rate. And this is going to help in bringing some kind of balance between the urban and rural digital divide. But it'll, in time. So it occurred to me that if we could spend a little bit of time to just think about in our role as communicators and with social media influence, or advising organizations with social media influence, what are your thoughts on how social media can play a role to a more influential role in moving this needle, maybe with a little bit more of acceleration to making breaking down the digital divide or reducing the digital divide in a safe and inclusive manner? Now, Rohan, I know this is your everyday, so I'm going to throw the question to you to start off our discussion.
Yeah, I could talk all day about this. You're right, Sylvia. Thanks. So I think the way to really think about this digital divide is the technology really needs to be built. Like, technology has been built for people like us, 300 odd million people, users of India, right? There's a reason why Amazon is now in Hindi as well, right? Because the 500 odd million people coming online for the first time, they're coming via their mobile phones, right? They've never had a computing device before. I know in India, we call them the next 500 million, sort of put them into a bracket. By 2022, we'll have about, this cohort will be even bigger than 500 odd million. And really, how do you take them on that journey, right? So which is where social media sort of comes in, like, to get them online. Why? Because you want them to realize the power of the internet, right? For employment opportunities, for productivity, and to be able to access aspirational services, to be able to create a strong and responsive government and administration, to be able to protect your own individual agency, right? All of these things are now are individual, are online and digital. So the way we sort of think about it is really taking them down this journey of trust, right? First, you get them to communicate, then you get them to sort of really be on social media, and then you get them to transact and take part in financial transactions and product transactions on the internet, because that's really how they will sort of realize the power of the internet. So as you go down this journey, I think social media has a very critical part to play, because that's the gateway, in a sense, right? That's communication. So, and I feel that's where social media has an especially key role to play, to set up context of what it is to use the internet, right? So how do you do that? You do that through creating platforms that are actually localized, right? That have local context, right? So another example would be a shopping, like a shopping site will have a shopping cart symbol, right? But someone in Raebareli has probably never been to a supermarket, right? So that's a dissonant experience. So how do you make it local to that lady in Raebareli, for example, right? So I feel social media then has a very critical part to play over there. The other part that social media has a critical role to play also is actually in ensuring that the next 500 million understands the vulnerabilities that the internet exposes them to, right? Which is, like I was saying, the protection of individual agencies, etc. And here I just want to quickly share an experiment we did with Nilesh Mishra, who is one of India's leading storytellers, and we actually created a radio show which we broadcast in 58 markets and in 5 different languages, called Zindagi Mobile, which was about stories of second, tier 2, tier 3, and rural India, and almost real stories, right, that Nilesh and his team wrote, talking about these gaps that exist, and how you must actually transact online, and creating trust, and people sharing OTPs when they shouldn't, people buying into fake news when they shouldn't, but like women not getting access to mobile phones, but the benefit of what happens when they actually get that. So suffice to say that I think that there are several approaches to this social media conundrum, but I think it all begins with being able to create trust in this digital divide. And I know Sylvia will talk a little bit more about the gender gap as well in this, but I think just the ability to be able to communicate to people saying, hey, look, it's safe, it's important, it's safe, and it's going to be a big part of your thing. Because the implications are massive. There's skilling, there's employment, there is entrepreneurship, there's, now of course education, so I think the benefit of is obvious to them, but I think now it's a question of ensuring that the nudges that social media can provide them along the way and building that trust becomes that to me it has to be the critical focus.
Building that trust and ensuring that they've actually and giving them the knowledge to deal with it appropriately. Yeah. Would anyone like to add to this discussion rather than point? I'm going to come to you, Melissa, on the gender diversity aspect.
Yeah, let me just go on this quickly because that's a part of my day-to-day job, right? I mean, we work with a company where you have to transcend the digital divide. Every aspect of the company I work with is about transcending the digital divide. If you're wanting to kind of make people anywhere in India be able to buy whatever they want or sell whatever they want from all kinds of remote areas, or see content from anywhere, be able to use digital payments, all of that's really about digital divide. And there are a lot of different things that companies like ours and many others are working on it. And I think sometimes it's important to realize that digital divide is therefore much more than social media. And I think the best aspect of the digital divide is that when people start seeing the benefits, so yeah, how do you reach those benefits out to them? We have situations like Majuli Island is a place in Assam. It's the largest man-made island in Assam. It's a place where people in that island used to go to mainland to shop because they hardly had anything available. And then because we now deliver to Majuli Island, people are willing to shop. For them, it's just a part of their basic day-to-day necessity, which has just been met. And that's true for so many different remote locations. A lady who, from a very small town in Tamil Nadu, used to love making toys. She was married, she was not allowed to go out and work, and she started selling those toys on Amazon. I mean, these are the people. She wasn't some, entrepreneur out there, looking, to create some kind of a unicorn. She was just wanting to get these toys, these wooden traditional toys out there. These are the people who are beginning to now recognize that internet, and I think we are at a very unique point in history where internet can really make these changes. And I think there are a lot of us who are working with companies who are looking to help make these changes. Social media is one component which many of us can perhaps leverage to an extent, but it goes back to convey the benefits, find those real benefits, and find the real ways where the number of people who use digital payments today, I think India is pretty much leading the world in many ways because of the India Stack and the UPI. I think the ease with which we all make digital payments, whichever part of, whichever brand we might use, I think that's important. And I think it's really important to then think about communicating those benefits. So I sometimes worry again that we tend to think social media is like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. And I think we need to kind of think beyond this, think bigger, think stronger, create those stories, find ways to disseminate. I think Rohan mentioned Nilesh Mishra. We worked with them. I think there's a great, there are people like Lalan Top, and there are so many of these storytellers who are beginning to find a way to get out there and tell the stories. So I think it's about just bringing those collaborations in play.
Thank you. Thank you for adding to that discussion. Girish, are there any examples that that you'd like to talk about in terms of where social media is being used effectively to kind of break down the digital divide and join in on this discussion?
I'm really glad Minari is on this call, and I'm really glad that she shared the story of being able to bring in sellers who previously didn't have access, but now are able to sort of join this brave new world of being able to, access markets through the internet and social media, and not just that, but also the whole host of information and access to health information. And it's not just access to social media and selling, but it's access to opportunity. And unfortunately, there's while it's helping level, the playing field for people who previously didn't have that access, it's also, I guess we're talking about the divide because those who don't have access to it, the inequality is just sort of widening further and further. And we've talked about various ways of sort of going beyond social media and internet to therefore reach people on the fringes who don't have that access. But there's one thing that I wanted to sort of bring up here is, what do we do about making the people who do have access, just making it a safer experience for them? Because just because you're on social media doesn't mean that, you've now come to the promised land, as it were. The social media has its share of problems and challenges. And, I think earlier we talked about mental health and bullying and trolling and all of that. So even for those who have the access is not equal. And of course, I'm sure we'll come on to, why women don't have enough access to it. But I think 2 points I want to make. I think there's a role that we have to play in two ways. One is in the filtering of misinformation and disinformation, and making sure that we are not contributing to it. That's one. And the second is, I wanted to talk a little bit about the bystander effect in social media. That's something that one of my clients, Breakthrough, who works on sort of ending gender discrimination, talks about in terms of the physical world, and what is our role as bystanders when you see things that shouldn't be the way they are. We're sort of naturally hardwired to ignore them because it's not our business. But they sort of talked, of course, one of their most famous campaigns is the Bell Bajao campaign, which is, if you hear something untoward happening in the neighbor's house, go and ring the bell. And I think that same principle should apply to us also on social media, which is when we see people being bullied or harassed, don't just be observers. Call it out. Even if that means you're going to get yourself into that muddle that you're seeing form, you have to step up and stand up for someone else, because if nobody does, we're just leaving them to the wolves.
Which is what you brought up right at the start about the responsibility that one has as a communicator and also as a human being, really. Whole different panel discussion that, Girish, we'll have to take that on board. I'm going to just quickly touch on the last thing that we've got a couple of minutes to talk about. It links in with the digital divide, but probably more in a gender perspective. In our country of 48% females, only 4 out of 10 have access to the internet. Is that a problem for the marginalized voices of women? Is it further marginalizing it? What could we as communicators do to perhaps make some change towards that, Melissa?
It's a very good topic. And again, we can talk for hours on this, Sylvia. But I'd also like to say, I was just looking at how the representation of women and men, even in the SMILE report, right? And there's less than 30% women represented in that report, which is no different from what's happening in the rest of society. So on one hand, you have not enough women on social media, because they are being online is disproportionately at risk. And I think when you're talking about the digital divide, remember, we're talking about marginalized societies that don't necessarily have the support and infrastructure that they may require, even in their ordinary lives. They're subject to so much violence and, all of that. And even when you're talking about, online learning for students, for instance, it's more boys that have access to it than girls in households, because in many households the preference is to give that little the laptop or the tablet to the boy. So I think there is definitely an issue that we're facing, but we have to be careful when we, it's not about bringing more women into just online. I think there's a lot of support and infrastructure that needs to be provided. Earlier we talked about safety, and I think we need to create the safe space for them because they are at risk online. And it's a great platform to share ideas, to build communities, etc. But women are often silenced, they're often censored online. And I don't know, I mean, you need some amount of strength to be able to handle all of this. So it's a very difficult situation. I'm glad that companies like Amazon that Mina talked about earlier. I think it's great to have those kind of that kind of structure because what Minari says, I think, provides that support that the women need in a safe space. I don't know how many can do that, but I think that's the kind of probably approach we need to take.
Thank you. That opens up so many other things, but we're going to just hold it on that, particularly that point about whether women are more vulnerable on social media. But I'm going to give Rohan a chance to say something really quick before we wind up, because we're getting close to our time on this.
Sure. Yeah, and just very quickly, like I think, especially as the homegrown social media networks, which tend to be a lot of, the barrier to entry is much lower because of language and also because of content on the whole thing. And I feel like there's almost a, an inherent sense of responsibility that they must take on in order to make it safe for women. We've seen Twitter, my alma mater, but took very long to take security and trolling seriously, and they suffered for it, right? But I wonder whether the coups, the Snapchats, now the name just escapes me, but the homegrown networks, really need to take that seriously, and because ultimately that's where the next half billion, and that's where the early users are. So I think that's basically to add to what Melissa was saying.
Yeah, where there's the responsibility.
I just make one very quick point, Sylvia, on this. I do think we need to remember that social media reflects what's happening out there. It might be an echo chamber, it might be an enhanced, skewed place, but the ground reality is we're talking of women not being safe, women being vulnerable. That's a reality out there on the ground. Women are not safe. And that's the ground reality. When we see the misogyny or the trolling, etc., we're seeing a reflection of what's out there in the real life. I do want us to kind of remember it's a hard world out there.
Thank you. We're at 27 minutes. We've got a bunch of questions coming in here, but I'm going to take just one because I think we could probably have time for one of them. This question is from Priya. How much is it appropriate for PR and communications professionals to indulge in debates over social media or show their political ideological inclination, especially on Twitter? Do you think this could harm brand image? I'm going to give this, who would like to show of hands, who would like to take this up? Oh, there you go. I think I was, okay. Rohan, off you go.
I've been speaking a lot. Minari, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, okay.
I thought I was speaking a lot too. I think
very quickly.
I think it's good. Yeah, I think it's good to be honest. I think it's good to be civilized. I think if you're civilized and correct about expressing yourself, it's fine to be honest about what you stand for. It's when you get into being uncivilized and ugly in how you talk that there is a problem. So it's fine to be correct about taking a stand as long as it's done in a very rightful, thought-through manner. Of course, there are times when one needs to be careful because, yeah, we have responsibilities for our brands, and that's what makes it even more bigger responsibility that when we do express ourselves, we do so with a lot of care. But it doesn't mean that we don't express ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I think the key things that are coming through right from the start are our responsibility, being authentic, all of the kind of things that are about communication anyway. So in social media, it's kind of exacerbated. We're right at the end of time, so I'm sorry that I'm going to have to call it a day. It's been, as I said, I think Reputation Today will have to do us another session to continue these topics. But with that, thank you, panelists, for being so vibrant and getting into the discussion. I'm going to hand over to Anubhuti to say a final word of thanks.
Thank you, Sylvia. A fabulous discussion indeed, and we could have gone on and on with this. I'm sure our listeners today are going away with a lot of learnings and tons of inspiration on social media. I would like to thank our panelists, Girish, Melissa, Minari, and Rohan for their time and insights today. Thank you to all our attendees for taking the time out this evening. We will be back with more opportunities of learning and sharing. Meanwhile, join us for season 2 of Spectra, scheduled on 23rd, 24th, and 25th of September. Sign up at bit.ly Spectra21. See you soon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.